So our next speaker is Jean-Pierre Thibaut. Jean-Pierre is Professor of Developmental Psychology at the University of Burgundy, Franche-Comté. His research predominantly focuses on the interwoven processes of concept learning, word learning, generalization, and analogical reasoning. Professor Thibaut has a specific interest in the role that executive functions play in learning and reasoning, and also using eye tracking methods to elucidate how executive functions interact with reasoning and learning. And today he's going to be discussing some of his work, investigating this relationship across the lifespan. So if you're ready, Jean-Pierre, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thanks.
Fabulous.
So thank you, Matt, for organization, and Margarita, and Nick for the brilliant talk. What I'm going to do here is to elaborate a little bit, to give examples, illustrations of the role of executive functions and comparing children with adults. So maybe everybody knows about what an analogy is. The first thing I would keep here from this slide would be that complex domains means more comparisons. And that's probably what I'm going to illustrate here, and what will be the main topic of my talk. So if you are a developmental psychologist, you would probably agree that there are two different types of explanatory mechanisms which are postulated in the developmental literature. And one is that an increase in domain knowledge might explain a children's performance. The more you know in a domain, the more you will have the capacity to extract the relevant relations in an analogy. And then a second explanation would be that in terms of executive functions, and the more you know, the more your executive functions are available, functional, the better you perform in analogy task. So that would mean that failures might be in an analogy task might be explained by weaker executive functioning, despite if you can prove that the children or the older persons have the appropriate relational knowledge. In that particular explanation, working memory has been assumed as an explanatory mechanism, and also inhibition of semantically related to unrelated distractors, also more general task control factors. So here, as I said, my goal is to look at in what terms executive functions might be involved in analogical reasoning, and I will make a parallel between children and aging people. So for example, here, let's try to illustrate what inhibition, the role of inhibition in a simple scene analogy task. As here, as you know, in that kind of task, you have the experimenter point with an arrow here to a target, and you have to find out which one would play the same role here in the below scene. But as you can see, there is a very attractive, appealing cat, which might play the role of a semantic and a perceptual distractor. And as far as we know, and Lindsay, Richland, and collaborators have shown that when you add this kind of related distractors, it makes the task harder for kids than if it's an unrelated distractor, which can be explained in terms of executive function, more particularly inhibition. So why would executive function be involved in an analogy task, especially in terms of general monitoring of the task? Because when we are comparing the base domain and the target domain, you compare them. You might go from one to the other, test different hypotheses if the analogy is not very straightforward, which means that you have to store intermediate results in working memory, generate novel hypotheses, which means using cognitive flexibility, and inhibit potential distractors. So there is an interest in comparing children and aging people, because in children, knowledge and processing are intertwined. They both developed in parallel. So, but in aging, all people have perfect knowledge, as we know. I mean, in terms of normal aging, but they have executive function difficulties, which has been demonstrated on many occasions and zillions of papers. So my summary would be, let's look at what happens in terms of inhibitions in children, in aging people, the role of inhibition in aging when it is tested more directly, and eye tracking measures in children and aging with the intent to show that their patterns of answer are virtually the same in both age groups. So manipulating the distractors is a nice way in children. We can manipulate their number and type of distractors and see to what extent this will influence the results of their in a typical experiment. So let's start with this one. Here, the thing you have to understand is an elongation relation. So you could have a no competition condition in which the correct solution is here, and there is no distractor. Here, a single competition condition in which, again, the correct solution is here, but you have a perceptual competitor. And then free competition, so I mean free distractor condition, in which, again, the correct solution is here. And all of these, are distractors compared to the base domain and the C term. So what the results show here, it's an experiment comparing 5 years old, 8 years old, and 14 years old. And what we say where there were different types of transformation, including no transformation. But what is absolutely sure is that the no competition in each condition was easier than the single competition and also the free competition, which we interpreted in terms of difficulty to inhibit these competitors. And then another way to use distractors, which are not semantic, is just adding noise. So for example, if you compare these conditions here with these ones, they are virtually the same, except that we just added here, in the noise case, we just added random textures. And again, we manipulated, we compare no competition and a competition condition. And then, sorry for these very complex graphs, but as you can see, here you have 6 years old, okay? And then in the no conflict case, they are clearly better, those 6 years old, than in the conflict case. And this is also the case for the 8 years old here compared to these two here. So conflict makes a lot of sense here and really disturb the kids. And if you look at the RTs, as you can see here, the presence of a conflict or the absence of a conflict does not make the task much more complex for the 14-year-old, who were also very good in all the conditions, which means that they probably were, since the relation was not very complex, they could go through the distractors with no real difficulty, except maybe here in the worst case, which is noise with conflict. But if you look at the 8-year-old, the pattern is very interesting, because what you see is that in the difficult cases for that, the difficult conditions of that, when there is a conflict, whether or not there is noise is irrelevant here, they took more time. And here, the 6-year-old, this is rather mysterious, because nothing really seemed to embarrass the small kids, except that when you relate these results here, this pattern of RTs with the performance, what becomes obvious is that they were very fast also in the most difficult cases, because in fact they were very they had very poor performance here. So the interpretation is that they were too fast and they selected too often the distractors. That's why there is no difference here, because they went immediately for the distractors. And you can play the same game with the same children with semantic analogies. Here you have a strong association with, now given Nick talk, you know what it means. Strong association, a bird with a nest and a dog with a dog house, and only one semantic distractor. And then here, a much worse case with a weak association and three semantic distractors. So weak association in the sense that people would acknowledge that the relation here between the dress here and the, well, I don't remember the name in English, okay. The relation here is understandable and we control that the kids could understand it, but it's less obvious. It's not the first thing that comes to mind. And here, the same story with the jacket and the rack here. And here we added three distractors. So you can cross the two factors. So you have one or three semantic distractors and weak or strong association. And what you get is a textbook interaction in which you can see that strong association, in the case of strong association, even those kids, they were not embarrassed. They had no difficulties with the three semantic distractors. It's probably due to the it's probably due to the fact that since the association is very straightforward, they were not disturbed by the distractors. But here, look, when there is only one semantic distractor, they were not that embarrassed distracted by the one distractor, but when three semantic distractors are in competition with the other option, the target option, it makes a big difference for the kids who probably has difficulties to inhibit here, while they have difficulty, they have to probably go through what we call a semantic space which is much broader here than here in the case of strong association, just because the solution is less straightforward, which means probably that also here in a weak association, you have strong associated which are irrelevant, which are also activated and can disturb the kid. So far, distractors interfere with children's performance, despite available knowledge that we thing that we always checked after the experiment. In aging, let's have the same story. And what we know that in aging, of course, the world knowledge does not decrease with age, but yeah, executive function, they decrease significantly with age. So we studied this issue of the connection between inhibition and other processes and analogical reasoning in kids. And we had three groups, so the young adults, the old adults, and very old adults, I may say so. And what is interesting here is that the whole had a better vocabulary than young, even though their level of schooling was a little bit inferior, only in the very old case. So we again four conditions, 2 by 2, with high and low association and no or two semantic distractors. Here you have a case of a low association strength case and 2 distractors, which are here, and 2 unrelated distractors. So again, again a messy graph, but I can which illustrated interaction between a number of distractors and association strength. Forget the ages here. What you can see, and it's a very nice parallels with what I've just shown with children here, is that when the items are highly associated or low, but no distractor, there is no difference. Whereas here, when there are distractors, it has an effect, a negative effect, but even worse effect when the association is low. So to summarize it, the low association case is more difficult than the high association case is when there are two distractors, which is not the case when we have when there is no distractor. And another step in that research was that we correlated the scores with independent measures of executive function. And here again, the table is a bit complex. What we did is a hierarchical regression analysis. And then if you take condition by condition, there is one which is relevant, but because there was no age effect here, no age influence. But in the high association case, when you compare young versus old, the very old, and this is the same story with the low association condition, when you compare young with the very old adults, it happens that processing speed had a significant effect, contribution, but also inhibition. So it's written non-significant because what the measure is given that there is an effect of age, what is left of this effect of age when we remove the contribution of processing speed? And it turns out that age is non-significant again, so it means that processing speed has a significant effect here. So that's exactly what I say. So my intermediate summary would be in both children's and adults, it looks like there is interference of semantic variables like the association strength and distractors that we can be explained in terms of inhibition. So one step further would be to look at how those kids and those older people do when they look at the analogy, when they're involved in the analogy task, and the kind of strategies they follow. So one way to study this would be to study their eye tracking, eye movements. So here the story would be which stimuli are gazed at, which stimuli I compared with which other one, and when those comparisons and those gazes take place. That would be the story. One way to do it in aging here, I'm starting with aging people. This is an experiment done and adapted with Richmond, where remember the task, and the solution here is to select this thing, avoiding here. So the story here is, the question is, can we observe regular patterns across ages? I mean, when we compare different ages. For example, is there an exploration of the base domain and then the target domain? How are the alignments? How do these groups perform in these kind of things? So the data are quite complex, but let me show you what happens with the older group. And what is quite obvious here is that at the beginning, this is the first third of the trial. So it's the beginning of a trial. What are they doing? They are looking at the bee. So that's the animal, the cat, which is pointed to by the experimenter. But they also immediately explore the target, which is the naughty boy. But also, they also explore I don't know, systematically is the correct word, but they also explore the scene, the above scene, the AB scene, call it like that, and the below scene. If you compare with the young group, what happened is that they are more systematic and more strategic. In fact, that's the way in which we interpret it. They focus on the cat, which was pointed to by the experimenter, and then they, at this very beginning of the trial, they look much less at the scene AB and the scene AD and the scene AB, sorry, and the below and the above scene, and also much less at the target. And if you can look, there is a nice evolution here from the young group to the older group, with the old group here in between, and that's the same. We have the same story here. Again, the same thing here with the older group. They look at, again, at B, but also they explore more the scenes than the young group, which do it much less. So it looks that the young people are really targeting, focusing on what is relevant in the task. Same story here, eye tracking story with classical analogies, the same kind of analogy I just showed you before. So again, here my sky rocket example, which is a weak analogy, and again, two unrelated distractors, two semantically related distractors, and the analogical match. And we have exactly the same pattern, which is the older group, they look at their AB, which is meaningful, of course. They start with their base domain to see what's going on, analyze it, and try to understand which relation is relevant. And you see that they focus more on C, which at this time is rather irrelevant. But they also look at the semantic distractor and also at the unrelated distractor. When you compare this pattern with the young group, they are more selective again. They are looking at the AB much more than here in the set of options among which they have to choose the correct solution or the incorrect ones. So again, it's the same pattern of less strategic organization here with the older group. If you look at the switch pattern that I won't show, this is exactly confirmed. So you have much less A-B switches in the old group than in the young group at the beginning of the trial. Let's have a parallel with children. Here, same kind of semantic analogies, except that we cannot use words because they're a little bit too young. In France, they cannot read before 6, so it would make no sense to study them with word analogies. So it's the same kind of analogy as the one I introduced before. And here again, we want to analyze what we call the temporal dynamics of the search, and with exactly the same results. Look at the blue ones with adolescents and adults. They look at the beginning, more gazes, and at A, at B, well, a little bit at C, because it's, after all, it's the target. It's the focus of the instructions. People are heard, the instruction tell me what goes with C in the same way as A is going to be. So they are to some extent obliged to look at C. But much less T, much less gazes at the semantic distractors and the unrelated distractors than for the young kids. The young kids have less A-B gazes, less A and B gazes, sorry, more C, which is again the focus of the task. But they also go through, they already from the very start, it's slice 1 again, this is the beginning of the trial, they go through all the options, maybe less on, and they look a little bit, they focus a little bit less at the unrelated distractors. Yeah, again, sorry, difficult. Look just here at the slice 1, and these are the number of slices, the number of switches, sorry, number of transitions, for example, going from A to B or B to A. So not surprisingly, the kids have less of these transitions than the adults, but they have more irrelevant at this stage of the task. They have more C transitions with semantic distractors, or T semantic comparison between T target and the semantic distractor, which is irrelevant at this point. At this point in temporal point of the task, I mean at the very beginning of the trial. So it looks like that children and all the adults are similar in terms of their exploration strategies. And they're also very consistent because we can use other methods, for example, SVM, and we look at switches. And for example, if you compare the data from the children and the adults, there are a subset of switches, of transitions that clearly distinguish what children do at the beginning and what adults do at the beginning of a trial. But we can also predict, which is a little bit irrelevant here, but we can also predict the output of a trial. For example, if you start in a certain way, we can predict that the trial will be an arrow correct. Also the analogy task type, which means that each analogy task has its own signature. Also the difficulty level, we don't behave in the same way with an easy analogy and more difficult analogies. These things have been explained in a paper here, BRM, and we have a forthcoming paper also on this kind of things. However, I don't know whether I wouldn't want to leave the stage without telling you a story about world knowledge in aging, because world knowledge, of course, even though there is no difficult difference between young kids and between young adults and older adults in terms of world knowledge, even if the old adults have more world knowledge in many cases than the young adults. There is also a link, despite also the link between executive function and analogical reasoning that I illustrated before. There is a role for knowledge. We know that in children with Dedray, for example, work, which has plenty of contribution showing that. And in aging people, we know there is that nice proposal saying that knowledge protects, or let's say knowledge protects, to keep it simple, against cognitive aging. So here, what we did is to compare two groups of older people which differ in terms of their world knowledge, which were just assessed with a vocabulary test. So they had equivalent executive function score in terms of inhibition and flexibility, and they were lower than the young participants, of course. There was no difference in education, which is interesting to be noticed. And then the analogy task that we used was a very simple analogical. They just had to say whether this analogy is correct or incorrect. So train is to railway with car is road, which is probably correct. And when you look at the data and compare the young adults with the two old groups, the one with a good vocabulary performance, they did not differ significantly from the young adults, whereas the old adults with a poor vocabulary, they significantly differ from the ones who had good vocabulary performance, and also from the young, which seems to suggest that to corroborate this idea of a protection by knowledge. Okay, so my conclusion would be that, so the point was just to say that it's not because an older age we have those problems. I put myself in, now I can be a subject in my own experiments. So we have those increasing difficulties in inhibition and our executive function, that the role of knowledge should be underestimated. So my conclusion would be older adult children don't organize research like younger adults. Executive function matter, but also better word knowledge could counterbalance poor executive function aging. Overall, what I wanted to illustrate is that despite equivalent knowledge, kids or available knowledge, kids seem to and also older adults seem to organize a task in a different way compared to young adults. And then executive function inhibiting the main goal, inhibiting the irrelevant relation, inhibiting the distractor, can explain differences between the conditions and the age group. So thanks to all those people, and especially the people who gave me funding, the National Agency and the region of Burgundy, and of course, thanks to all of you for attending this talk. Thank you.